Hi, Ian.
Oh, hi, Richard.
Hiya. I guess there are other people joining, although we haven't actually had an email this week, have we?
No, we did just about 20 minutes ago.
Right.
Because I wasn't clear whether it to permanently move to 10:30 or what. Which is so I came in at 10 and it was for myself, so I just left. And then there was an email about a few minutes later from Nigel saying 10:30.
Oh right, I didn't seem to get that email.
Oh right, it's just a bit frustrating because I would have structured what I've been doing for the last hour and a half very differently if I'd known that I didn't have to be in a meeting at 10, but I did have to be at 1 at 10:30. Like, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I'm not a massive fan of editing files using Dropbox. I've never really tried to work through Dropbox before for editing shared files, but it just seems to be a morass of conflicting copies and things like that. I made some edits last night, and they just got. Hi, Nigel.
Hi.
Hi all.
Hiya.
Hi.
I think I've taken all your edits in, haven't I, Richard?
Possibly, but I tried to make some edits last night, and then I think that Lorenzo saved his file, and it just wiped mine.
Oh no! No.
Yeah. Wasn't completely successful.
How would? Oh well.
I thought I was safe working at kind of 12:30, but
yeah, no. I was very conscious of that. In fact, I this morning I noticed a conflicted version of mine, so I kind of just resaved it and said, "Don't edit this version." So, I mean, what had you been working on?
Well, to be honest, I was just going through trying to understand what was going on and making a couple of comments.
Well, I think that's what we can spend our time on today, is just looking at the overall coherence and whether actually some big sections are over in the right place or indeed need a bit more redistribution. I think, it's been the end of term, so nightmare of 8th week last week and principles, I can't tell you. So I think I was in a state of recovery for the last few days, but I think we're all hoping we can get some kind of time now. I noticed that there's some really quite interesting points in the comment lines that I'd like to discuss, and then the real thing is to try and pull out recommendations, I think, explicitly into a final section so that it is recommendation centric. I think there are good decent recommendations in there that we can extract out, and because I was only on the call for a little bit last week, and some people I think have been making really helpful amendments, but it had gotten to be such a changed version that it was just a nightmare, a blizzard of Microsoft track changes. So what we've got is hi Lorenzo, is a version that's a bit cleaner, and I think we just need to agree how we'll take it forward, and where there's still some gaps or where there's some issues around perhaps overemphasis on issues that have been perhaps a bit done to death or not, as the case may be.
Can I start with some comments?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I gave it a quick read and I left a few comments there. But I haven't really added much text. So the structure, I noticed that the structure of this paper is quite different from the structure of other papers I've come across. It's in many cases, there are like various sections with challenges. And here it looks like there are multiple sections about COVID, about the UK. And then all the kind of challenges seem to be condensed later on. I'm fine with it. It wasn't natural to me having seen other papers, but at the same time, every paper is a paper on its own right. So I let Valerie kind of maybe comment on this, or whether that is in itself a problem. Even if it's not, it seems very very UK and very COVID centric.
Yeah.
That irrespective of what the structure is, and I'm wondering whether we are happy with that, or we want to kind of modify that a little bit. I completely understand that COVID has revolutionized the data to a large extent, because so many more people were involved and were paying the consequences of it, and so I can see why COVID features very prominently here compared to other papers. But it still seems to be, it seems to be very much about what worked and what didn't work with COVID.
Yeah.
But so it's just a question whether we're happy with that or not.
I think that's a good general point. I mean, I think Valerie has made that point at various points. So we might just come back to that. It is a little bit, it is UK centric, and it is rooted in COVID. And that's probably because I think the experience of people putting this together was very much rooted in that. And actually it helps for concrete examples, because we can actually point with with the example of COVID in mind, we can point to real examples of where data integration has been a challenge, even when there's an existential problem to face like that. So with huge amounts of resource, we're still encountering these problems. And maybe we need to say something like that, because if we're too generic in the data challenges paper, my feeling is that we lose the insights we might have gained off the lived experience of COVID. I mean, but look, I mean, I'm happy to have that discussion. It's an interesting one. I mean, Valerie and Dennis, in a way, what's your view? It is somewhat UK centric, and it's very COVID focused. That is true. If we abstract away from that, we could do that in the write-up, in a sense.
Yes. quite how to answer this. I mean, obviously the plan for the issue is very much future pandemics.
Yeah.
So obviously a lot of the challenges that people are realizing have been brought to mind because of all the COVID experience, and so it's raising lots of challenges. But we are trying to sort of emphasize future planning and preparedness, and trying to take an international perspective, albeit the majority of the co-authors of the papers are UK based. On the other hand, one doesn't want to lose the experience that you're capturing here. So I think it's quite a difficult one. I mean, what we're doing with one or two of the other papers is where there was material that was more expository in a way. It was separating that off into a separate paper. Now, I suppose one could separate out something about, you know, the UK COVID experience as separate in terms of data, as separate from something else, but I'm not sure whether there would be much left if one tried to do that. So I'm not suggesting that as a sort of recommendation, just mulling over what the options are really here. Dennis, do you have thoughts?
No, so I was thinking maybe that Hans or other external advisors might be able to help here, because I think in asking Hans to look across all the drafts, I think an obvious question to Hans is to say that a lot of the papers, not all, but a lot, are rather UK centric, because you know, the authors are speaking from experience and they're mostly UK based. And if he can give any helpful pointers to you know, to other countries' experience, which is, you know, brings up radically different points, that would be very helpful.
That's a good point. And in general, what we've been trying to do when we've got to a position of having a nearly finished draft is to send it not just to Hans, but to a few sort of friendly faces who can comment informally. And maybe for this one, there might be people not from the UK that we know who could, you know, comment and perhaps add extra little bits of experience from elsewhere that could be useful.
I mean, my slight feeling about this is that some of our very concrete examples from people like Yasmina and actually from you, Lorenzo, are about the experience in the COVID modeling context, and those examples are quite compelling, and they're unlikely to be very different, I would think, as general challenges going forward. I mean, I think that will make the recommendations at the end more important to us, that they do need to generalize out from this particular example. I mean, you know, the point in a pandemic, whatever its nature, you know, testing versus what can you trust? Well, hospitalization, you can trust that, you know, and that might not always present itself in the same way, but that's quite interesting to think how you extract the general principle from that. Yeah, but Sorry.
Are you done, or do you want to continue?
No. I'm just mulling it over. It is a challenge. I understand the challenge.
Yeah. So my first thought is that if we want to change structure, or if we feel the structure needs to change a little bit, it's better to do it now than after you have kind of polished everything and made it nicely and then sent it to someone else who suggests change everything. That's why I think it would be better kind of to decide it sooner. And the second thing, I realized while I was making the comments, and many of the comments I was making is because they were about my experience in this pandemic in a section that was talking about this pandemic. So it was fairly easy for me to make the comment, but also next to each of these comments, I had a nagging comment that I didn't put in a draft because I didn't know how to fit it there. But the nagging comment was, I don't see a challenge here right now. Here, it sounds like a description of what has happened. So that in itself is not a challenge. What has not happened, the way it is currently phrased also doesn't sound like a challenge. And although the other papers are very UK-centric, because people speak from experience, the attempt to, for example, but most other people I suspect have taken is that you have perceived that as a problem. There was an issue that was probably not solved, and you can turn it into a generic challenge that applies to every pandemic. So you've experienced it. Your example is about COVID. Some other people have worked on some other emergencies and some other pandemics, and therefore they had other experiences that were not COVID. But the vast majority were COVID. But you could still phrase them as a challenge for the future. So if I were one suggestion would be, if we were to would it be possible to make a bullet point list of the challenges that this paper is suggesting? Can we kind of summarize this paper into a list of challenges? Would that be possible or not? Because if I look at the first 3 or 4 sections, I don't see any challenge. So either they are all at the end. The first 3 or 4 sections are more like a description of what has happened and what has not happened. But I was wondering whether
I think that's a good idea. I think that could be a very helpful idea. It would help crystallize. In fact, it was not a million miles from what I was thinking we'd need to do anyway, is to crystallize out, though, in the recommendations, you know, you're bringing out what the challenges are to be overcome in the future. By the way, I mean, perhaps one of our issues is from the very outset when we were talking about the structure of the paper and we talked about different perspectives, the data engineering principles which start the paper. Yeah. The FAIR principles, for example, I would submit, represent an outstanding set of challenges. I think it's absolutely the case that findability, accessibility, interop, and reusability are still challenges. And so I think we've seen that in the experience of COVID, and we'll see it again. It's very, very unlikely they will just fall away. They're great injunctions, but it's the devil's own job to materialize them. The point perhaps then is in later sections is how you bring out the experience. Perhaps we got a bit too locked into the data availability and models in this pandemic experience, but in some sense, some of that experience again is around, well, it's not just around findability, it's around the fact that such pressing questions were being asked that people just had to use what was there pretty bloody rapidly, didn't they? And that will sometimes drive that pragmatism between the principles on the one hand and the urgency of the questions being addressed on the other is always going to be a challenge. And there's something, of course, in the section in 8.3 where Glenn and others are talking, and Ben are talking about this issue of how you try and make your modeling susceptible to the demands of the data available, and as new data becomes available, how you adapt your models, etc. Yeah, question, Jasmina. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Just to say, I agree with Lorenzo that it's important to highlight bulletin point challenges, but there is also a thought process around getting to those challenges. And this is what the beginning of the first few sections is doing. Because if we just say, oh, these are the challenges, that almost like you picked out of a bag, whereas thinking through what has been done, the experience is what at the beginning few sections are doing before you come to the meat of it and you do the challenges. So this was the structure we were thinking. So I would say we don't particularly want to change that, but we can maybe at some point in the summary sort of summarize the bulletin point of the challenges still there now, if you want. Just my thoughts.
It's probably going to be a useful exercise to just enumerate them anyway. Just because some have come to the fore that weren't apparent when we were starting this exercise, of course. Yeah.
Just to come back to Jasmina, yes, I agree that like for everything, like for every abstract of any paper, you need a background, and then you need to conclude with some open issues, right? So I'm not saying that the background shouldn't be there, and I completely agree that the challenge is kind of the FAIR principles are themselves a challenge. Then all we need is a sentence after we talk about the FAIR thing saying this is still problematic, and there are maybe we can also quote some examples of why this hasn't worked, because at the moment it sounds like this is the FAIR principles, full stop. So there is no challenge in there. And
that's true. That's true.
Yeah. And so for
in
me,
fact, there's a comment in there somewhere that says that. I think I say this in following paragraphs. You need good and bad examples from to illustrate that.
So for me, it was completely new. I never knew about the FAIR principle. I completely agree with that. One challenge, but at the moment, it seems like it's teaching me what the FAIR principle is, which is fine and it's great, but it's probably not the main goal of this. It will be background information.
Sorry.
By the way, I think it's it's really helpful to hear you say that, because lots of us living in the data world think FAIR is like everybody's been converted to this view of the world. And in fact, it's nothing like that. And actually, so there's really something very important in what you say. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Alice, yeah.
I was going to say that I've been having a go at what a section on skills might look like in a separate document.
Yes.
And I think you could do a similar structure there where you can talk about this kind of ideal scenario where you've got this perfect combination of all the different skills working in this interdisciplinary team.
Yeah.
And then you can draw on examples and experience from COVID of how that did or didn't work in different cases. But then you can definitely generalize it out to some challenges around making skills available and organizing them quickly when required and this kind of thing. And that is an area which can vary internationally a bit, I think. I think probably the same like very big picture is true, but the details of how different countries organize things and exactly what are the challenges around, for instance, the one I know about, the research software engineering roles, there are different details in different countries about how easily those can or can't be created, for instance, in universities and different kinds of research institutes and things.
Look, I mean, I think there's some really, and there's also some interesting bulleted points at the beginning of the document as well, which Lorenzo left in there that still can be addressed. I mean, there is a different way of completely structuring this, which would be take the FAIR principles as the grounding structure and then interrogate how they were addressed in the pandemic or they were problematic and how they could be in the future. But that we didn't choose, that would be a big reformulation. And I think the question I would have for people in just looking at comments that have been left is, as we assuming that we can at the very least take the FAIR principles and give them a sense of why they're there as recommendations and what has and hasn't worked. And I think that is something we might revisit in the concluding section for sure. In our section 8.2, data and models, we say at the outset, this is very COVID specific and it's pretty UK centric. And I guess the question is, does that just get in the way? I mean, I found it very helpful because, again, as coming from a data perspective, this is the stuff you need to understand. So it depends who we think we're writing this paper for. And I think the data challenges chapter is something which is both for the epidemiological, but also the software and the data science world. And whether we've got the right balance there quite is a genuine issue.
So okay, so I agree with you. Again, I would see that as background. Whether the background needs to be large enough that it fits into in its own section, I'm somewhat less concerned about that. As long as by the end of the paper, we have in my mind, we have a clear list of challenges.
Yeah.
And rather than just being, this is factual information, which is great, but it's probably not what the paper is about.
Okay, I get that. Okay.
So that would be my suggestion is maybe the structure doesn't need to change that much as long as we can kind of come up with a clear list of challenges by the end of the paper. And if they are all appear at the last section, that's fine by me. Like personally.
No, that's a good point. Well, then just to say on that, we've got in section 8.2, data availability, and there's some interesting insights there. How that data has been used. It is particular, but it's quite compelling. And the question is, do those generate challenges going forward? The lessons learned, you might reframe that in 8.2.3 and so on. And I would just say I think we should be then looking at this whole section in terms of what challenges does it actually present. And so one question that I would have for our infectious disease and model specialists is in 8.2.4, we have this section which hasn't been really built out, which is data availability for future pandemics. So what wasn't there? And is that something we can do more on, or yeah, I mean, again, we might have fallen into the trap of being a little bit too COVID specific, but my question would be, is it likely that in future pandemics, the question of inter-subject variation is going to be profoundly important, because that's what happens to these things, and it's something that we need to be forewarned and forearmed about, or for example. So does that mean we should be thinking about collecting that kind of genomic specific variational data at the outset and not end up being surprised by it? Perhaps we weren't in practice surprised by it, but it seems to me that it has been interesting that we didn't have this anticipated unfolding in quite the way, or perhaps, I'm sure you modelers all saw that was going to happen, but it didn't seem to come through in the way people were thinking about the data we might need to collect. So does 8.2.4, examples of data that wasn't available and we would have liked to have had, serve an important purpose if we refactor it for these challenges? Valerie?
Yeah, my feeling when I read this was that 8.2.4 needed to be combined with 8.3.
Yeah.
I don't know whether people agree on that, but 8.3, I mean, it seemed to me that these 8.2.4 would provide examples for 8.3 to an extent.
Yeah.
And the other obvious thing was that 8.3, which I was going to raise earlier, 8.3 is written very much in the way of context and the challenge being made explicit within it.
Yeah.
And if possible, I think, and I suspect that's rather in contrast to what Lorenzo was just suggesting, but for me, if we could get some of the challenges up in the earlier sections so that they arise with the context rather than being gathered into a section at the end, I think it might, even if there's an overall summary at the end, if we could pick out the big issues as we go along, I think that would make it more consistent with the styles of the other papers, at least.
It's not at all in contrast with what I was saying.
Great.
I mean, to me, it sounds more natural as a structure, but that's just because I've read the other papers. If we want this paper to be different because it has born like this, it has grown like this, and it's very, that's the natural way in which it was formed, that's absolutely fine by me. I certainly don't want to come in and impose a structure from outside. But at the moment, the first 3 sections seem like factual information, and all of the challenges are then condensed in the last few sections. And that's fine, but it's a stylistic choice. To me, the most natural thing would be to kind of put a challenge next to the background for that challenge, which is what Valerie was suggesting. The FAIR principle, for example, to me, it sounds natural to say this is the FAIR principle. It's challenging to kind of implement it in practice. It's particularly challenging during a pandemic because you're in a rush, yeah, that sort of stuff. And then later on, there is a discussion about open safely, and I'm all pro open safely. Like I certainly have got tangentially involved, and their model works well and so on. It sounds very much like open safely does this, and this is great. And again, it's factually important and interesting. It sounds like it's becoming the role model that should be used in the future. It sounds like it has solved all of the challenges there, and there is no open challenge, and hence maybe maybe it's just it belongs into a paper about.
Well, I think there'll be plenty of challenges in open safely, like approaches, I suspect. So
I'm sure that's why spelling them out, I think, would be
pitching that. Yeah. Okay. I think this is partly the way the additive nature, the way the thing.
Absolutely, but by no means, please. This is just my opinions, and
it's really helpful. This is actually really good discussion. Ben.
No one, right? I certainly don't want to impose anything.
Ben.
Thanks. I was just going to reiterate what Valerie was saying, that in section 8.3, we are trying to highlight the idea that we should be collecting data sets, between pandemics, and to try and highlight what we think would be relevant, even though we don't necessarily know what the next pandemic is going to be or the nature of it. There's still generic data that's going to be useful irrespective of what that is. So that I think the genetic sequencing could very well be very important there, as well as the contact tracing and trying to get good models and good data sets on that, so that we can hit the ground running if a new pandemic does emerge.
Yeah. So that's the suggestion again, that quite a chunk of 8.2.4 can go into the this later section. Yeah. I think if we're able to keep reminding ourselves of the challenge as we write, and not just get too discursive. I think again, it's the way this was written. Here are the FAIR principles, motherhood and apple pie, but actually it turns out that they're actually difficult to implement, and these are clear examples of how and why that has been the case.
Yeah, in that sense, I don't think necessarily. Yeah, it's just adding a couple of sentences where we know the challenges are related there, I think could help a lot, I think. And it doesn't necessarily need to modify the structure that much. There are other challenges apart from the fact that this data is, all of the data should respect these principles, but in a rush, it's very difficult for this to happen. I think where Ben was talking about genetic data and so on, I agree that it's very difficult to kind of decide before what new data you will need in the future. But one of the challenges might be to keep the same levels of data flow now after the pandemic has finished. So for example, at the moment, the government is pulling together all of the NHS data for different hospitals and distilling an aggregate list of, for example, admissions and lots of other hospital stuff and bringing it at a national level. And I think that's extremely important. My question is whether this system will be ready for the next pandemic, because certainly hospitals do collect this data routinely. But because of the kind of privatization of the NHS, then the different hospital trusts are run as separate entities. And I'm expecting that at the end of the pandemic, or whenever the COVID becomes endemic, then this entire system might fall apart because there will be no more need to track COVID-19 hospital data. But as soon as a new pandemic arrives, I'm not sure whether the same system that has been developed now will still be in place. So that's, for example,
whether we think the system that's been put in place could be fit for purpose in other. I mean, one would hope that generic level, the question of integrated hospital, integrated admissions data would be, that would be, yeah. But there's no guarantee. Yeah, clearly that's a challenge. I mean, that is a natural segue, I think, into some of the later sections around data policy, which is again, it brings it into either pre-positioning a la EPIC or saying, you better be aware that the policies you need are supportive of the continued supply of essential national infrastructure, disease collection data, however you frame it. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the moment, that data is COVID-19 data.
Yeah.
Like, in telling me how many admissions of COVID-19 there has been. At the next pandemic, say there's another flu pandemic, then in itself, one would have to amend that for flu. And I hope it's relatively easy, but I'm not sure.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. It's interesting if to reflect on just what had to change to even gather that stuff effectively, and how the record keeping and the fields and the data entry all had to kind of change in some sense.
And in practice, that has been very difficult because the different trusts were told, oh, submit this data nationally. And every trust interpreted that data requirement slightly differently. So it happened that certain trusts only put their ICU data, but not the all hospital admissions, or other people submitted hospital admission by date of admission rather than by date of test or whatever. Like, every trust had tried to kind of fight in a moment of emergency where they had to deal with patients and people's lives. They had to deal with this kind of request, and everyone tried to address them the best they could. But it's not easy to pull together information from many different sources in one unique national data set without unavoidably having issues.
Yeah. Okay.
I just put a file, it may be completely wrong, but I just put a file called challenges in the Dropbox folder with a bunch of bullet points in. There may not be challenges that people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the sort of abstraction that's going to help us, I think.
There is another thought. I think it's possibly in one of the points I put at the beginning, which might help moving also out of the UK-centric view, is that the challenge is also kind of internationally publishing this data. And now it's easier, but especially at the beginning, I remember when we were kind of struggling in estimating the doubling time of the epidemic in the UK. If you get the doubling time for the confirmed cases, that could be affected by all sorts of biases. For example, in Italy, they locked at some towns and then they swabbed everybody in the town, at which point you're just picking up the number of cases based on the speed you swabbed them, not the speed of the epidemic. Yeah. But that's all that could be done. And so hospitals tend to be a much less biased estimate because people don't really change their hospital seeking behavior that much. And so without the Italian publicly available data on hospitals, there would have been no way for me to calculate a sort of like multiplicative factor between the published Italian cases and the hospital cases that would have told me something about how the hospitals and the cases were growing. And I used that heavily for the UK, just because it was publicly available from Italy. And so publishing stuff across countries is kind of internationally agreed maybe data publication systems. That's a huge challenge to me.
Have you dropped that example anywhere? Could you drop that example thought somewhere just to capture it? Because that's actually Yeah, a great example of where the broader. There was something I was going to come back to on that, which was there's a lovely phrase from I think Ben or Glenn about I evoked a trigger condition by actually pointing out to a Google supported effort to collect data sets together, but it was and it's quite an interesting set of data sets, but it's been done off the back of you don't know why that's set. You don't know whether they've got any particular view about how it's getting involved in models, but at least somebody has been busy trying to curate that stuff. And I think recognizing what the benefits and challenges of doing that international curation is, I mean, it has to be a big part of the, it could be a big part of the challenge set going forward is how do you, so one thing to pre-position, but how do you pre-agree the sorts of baseline data that ideally we'd love to have available in these contexts? Yeah. And can we generalize from that example in Italy to likely any rapidly emerging infectious disease? I suspect you might, because that's probably doesn't sound untypical of what might happen. Yeah. Sorry, Ben.
So just following on international data challenges, I think another one is particularly in lower middle income countries where infrastructures are much lower. I think there's a huge amount of extra challenges in terms of collecting this sort of surveillance data, especially as they often have their own endemic diseases like malaria that they're struggling to manage as well. So if on top of that you have to account for a pandemic as well, you know, some of the challenges they've faced is, do we stop collecting data and stop dealing with the endemic diseases and focus on COVID, or do we not manage COVID and hope that nothing happens and then just keep going with endemic diseases? So whilst I think it's great to sort of prioritize collecting these data sets internationally, I think, you know, in this country and similar Western countries, we're in a much better position to be collecting this data than other countries that are already struggling to manage their own endemic diseases as it is. So that might be another challenge we can look at. We've been working on a few LMIC countries, and some of the challenges we've faced are just trying to get hold of these data when we know that, you know, the infrastructure just isn't there to collect it. And whether that's a WHO priority in terms of their responsibility. I know Dennis has mentioned that before, or whether it's our responsibility where we have the infrastructures to support that in LMICs, but then, you know, funding has just been massively cut in the UK for UKRI funding for foreign aid. So that's
haven't they? Yeah. Yeah, just cut it in half or more than half. Yeah. Alice.
So it's a new point. So if anyone was wanting to respond to that,
well, yes, I think I've just taken that in. I think there's some, yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I was going to mention, looking at, I think Richard's list of challenges looks like a really good summary. I wondered if there is one around sort of how you manage the sort of quality of the different things that go into the results, and like partly just there's a real challenge, unsolved, possibly unsolvable challenge around sort of expectations for things like software quality or data quality, and like the completely unrealistic level of investment you'd have to put in to make everything up to some kind of completely robust quality, when you don't know in advance which bits of software or which bits of data are suddenly going to become crucial in a sort of new rapidly evolving situation. And then part of the challenge is the sort of communication around that and expectations, and making sure that the sort of level of the confidence you have in, say, model software or something like this is communicated along with the results and sort of feeds into that overall picture. I think at the time there was some stuff that became controversial in public around software quality, for instance, where a lot of people from outside, you know, sort of industry software engineers and things were jumping in with very little understanding and trying to pick holes. And so this conversation about what can you do, how far can you go in predicting which things you might come to rely on very heavily and investing in that, and how far is that something you just have to manage in the moment.
I mean, I think it's just we can't solve all of these challenges, obviously, and there's no perfect infrastructure that we believe will just arrive, even in the face of something like this. But I guess what we are doing is using it to put people on notice that there will be, and that's one of the challenges, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, you know, how far can you get?
But that you can make a point that it's a more subtle thing. It's not just that, you know, somehow researchers are doing software all wrong and that they should be doing it to industry standards. It's a completely different situation.
Well, could we recommend? What we might recommend is if we take Richard's kind of core initial set and just add things that we think are clearly missing or that are suggested in the paper, we can keep revisiting that as our kind of, have we remembered to kind of, you know, highlight this challenge? Is it there? And is it described in a way that isn't so COVID centric? Nobody could take a general lesson from it, or so UK centric. Valerie.
Yeah, can we, in taking that list, and obviously this reflects the fact that I know very little about this area, but many of the people reading it might be in a similar position. Can we, when we're writing about these things, make it clear what the hurdles are to some of these things? You know, why is this not being done? How much of a hurdle is it? Is it something that can be sorted simply, or is it a whole research project to sort out how to do something? Because a lot of the things that we were thinking of in general, we're thinking of challenges in terms of things that people might need to set up, you know, a PhD student or a postdoc to look at over a period of time. Now, with some of these, I guess it's more setting up infrastructure, but it would still be useful, for me at least, to have a feeling for what stops these things being done and what needs to be put in place to enable them, and how big a problem that really is. Some of them, I suspect, are huge.
Yeah. Whereas
others might be a bit easier.
Yeah, sometimes it's about aligning incentives or getting incentives to people to do some of this work. Sometimes it's about having an organization that's even got a mandate to try and determine standards. And you're right. So we could probably elaborate on that. Yeah.
Bring it out a little bit more might be helpful.
I've always found Valerie's comment extremely helpful, reminding me that we do not need to solve these challenges.
No.
We really don't. So some of them might be easy to solve, some of them might be difficult to solve, some of them might look impossible to solve, like Alice mentioned before, probably unsolvable. But that shouldn't stop us from mentioning them.
No, and what is their essential nature? I mean, are they? Is it where's the failure? Is it organizational? Is it in the technology? Is it? Yeah, some of this is in.
For example, one of the fact that things will definitely be imperfect if new things appear and you're in a rush to give an answer. That it's an unsolvable challenge. We can do the best we can. And if it's something that we have seen before to some extent, then we might be more ready for it, but not necessarily. Like there will be cases where we are not ready for it, and then you'll have to do things really fast, and you're going to do them imperfectly, unavoidably. So that sort of so the FAIR principles will not be respected. So that's a challenge that I don't think will ever be solved, but we should still mention it.
Good point. If we just, having taken all those issues on board, just also look at, as we get through the paper, there is quite a lot on the, open safely. I think we can recontextualize. It isn't the answer to everything, and the issue then around the Scottish COVID response and EPIC. I think what we found very interesting about that was just this whole notion of some forethought on what needs to be put in place. So that's what we'll be looking at there. How do people feel about the fact that there's quite a lot on EPIC, but it's interesting.
So maybe I just say, I just thought it was useful for. When I was starting to read through the rest of the paper, as per all the previous conversation, I was thinking, I'm not totally quite clear how this is all going to integrate. So I thought the best thing to do was actually just write kind of bring out the points that you had actually flagged, Nigel, into the document, and then just expand them, put in the detail, at least some initial kind of, hopefully make it clear where it probably will link back to some of the FAIR principles, for example, but then leave it, and basically we can cut out stuff that's extraneous, and we almost certainly would need to add some stuff to link it back to the challenges that have been defined earlier. But I'm not precious about the material. It just gets it down there, really ready for editing. Yeah,
we will boil it back anyway because we're we need to get something that's digestible and as succinct as it can be. That's for sure. But no, it's very helpful. I find it very helpful instantiation. What could go in appendices? Possibly, yeah. Are people using appendices reasonably in other papers? I hadn't.
No, we're not. But I mean, it might be that here, as I said a minute ago, there is this idea of having supporting expository papers in a few areas. But here it might be that, I mean, I think we want the basic points in the main body of the paper, but perhaps some of the detail about the workings of things, FAIR principles or EPIC or whatever. If there was more factual stuff that you wanted to be available, than was necessary to describe the challenges, maybe we could use appendices as a way of not, Ian was just talking about pruning stuff out. Well, maybe not losing it all together, his prunings, but sort of dividing it into 2 bits and keeping it in an appendix might be an alternative strategy.
Yeah. Can I just ask, Min, did you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah. If I could jump in, and so the visualization team have discussed our sort of archive paper and would like to sort of formally propose to if we can have an opportunity to write a set of challenges related to visualization. So based on Lorenzo's discussion earlier on, so I'm thinking there's the 4 possible challenges we can consider is the main issue from the COVID point of view. And the first is that the amount of data and the amount of data, the captured data as well as the model generated data is just so huge. And also the individual modeling teams, which are required to see those data, see the models' behaviors, is also very specialized in their individual way. And so the visualization provision, such as by the ONS and or other governmental operation, will not be good enough to support the modeling scientists. The second challenge is although the modeling scientists in some other area, for example, like computational fluids, has been used to use the visualization support. There's more than 500 papers published just by the visualization community, and including there were 6 survey papers just on how different visualization techniques can help with computational fluid dynamics, but hardly any paper ever published on the epidemiological modeling from the visualization community. So the support has been very weak. And also the modeling scientists in the epidemiology may not be used to getting support and do not know actually what to ask and what kind of help they can get. And so that's a second challenge. The third challenge is with so much data and all the support required from the modeling scientists, is ideally there should be a kind of infrastructure so we can avoid repeated work for every team, and so the data can be concentrated. So with the Richard and Alice and the others working on the data, so there's a data infrastructure. Naturally, there should be a provision through such a similar infrastructure for visualization, but we don't have that. We don't have that in the country. In fact, we don't have that in the world, and that is a one major missing infrastructure components for any emergency issue. The fourth problem is in the UK, we have something about 100 modeling teams. The total number of UK visualization experts are less than 20, and in terms of that sort of a scale. So we actually don't have enough people to support the individual team. So ideally, we need to find a way to. That's why the way we organize. So this is the sort of 4 challenges that, and we would like to use our experience to demonstrate it is possible to meet those challenges by providing some kind of infrastructure for the future, and also get the visualization colleagues to group together as a whole team to provide the modeling team in a collective way, rather than sort of an individual person attached to a modeling team, which will not be very effective. So that's the way hopefully we can write a paper about it.
Min, so if that gets covered in depth in your paper, there's a sort of hook in the skills section in ours where you could maybe just cross-reference to that and add a sentence or two and mention
absolutely
in detail, because we're trying to do a sort of overview of the skills and how they might be organized in this section. And
I think skill definitely is a gigantic shortage, and I in the UK we managed to recruit 2 programmers from industry. We managed to convince 2 academics to write the codes, and I compared to Stuttgart, Constance universities, and Hong Kong and the Science and Technology. Each university will have more programmers than we have who can do the job. It's just with the whole country, and we have 20-ish academics, but hardly any PhD students around to help it out. So that, I'm not making a complaining about it, but we sort of we managed to do something even in that kind of environment.
Just to be clear, are you proposing to use your archive paper as an additional paper in the collection? Is that what you're trying to get?
That's what we hope we can. And but of course, I realized that there's a 10 challenge. Sort of a 10 is a nice number. Having 11, which is may.
No.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a special place for an arithmetic with base 11. Anyway, listen. What do you? I don't know. I mean, that's. It would be great if it's going to appear that we can cross-reference it. It clearly helps us, I think, as you say.
I just put the link in for you, Min, where you could see where it would be a good place to add that cross-reference.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. So just looking at where we are on the time, it's been a very helpful discussion. Sections on data institutions, data policies, there are going to be clear lessons, as we're talking to Ian about that, and our data skills. So, I mean, I think 8 becomes much more, 8.8, the recommendation for future data. I mean, not saying it's even for future data ecosystems. I mean, it's recommendations really, which is to just pull out the lessons learned and re-summarize them.
Excuse me.
Then the question really is moving from what we have now to a more finished draft, so that Hans and other people can have a look at that. Is that something that can happen reasonably rapidly? Is the question. What we don't want is the catastrophe of overwrites, which of course is something that we've actually need to be careful about. So I just think that at this point, I'm going to suggest that we particularly elaborate perhaps that short challenge section that just as a working note that Richard sent around with the additional insight from Valerie, that we make sure we remember why is this, what kind of challenge is this in actual fact, and then just as we're going through the paper, remind ourselves that we've got this. It's got a slightly different style because as we come to section 8.3, then the challenges are interspersed very much more clearly. And I think if we can achieve something like that throughout the rest, that'll help. And then we need to see whether it meets some of the concerns that Lorenzo has in terms of having a much more of a challenge-centric approach rather than enumeration of facts or a descriptive piece on FAIR principles without reminding people why this A, matters, and B, has been challenging.
I guess we can cross-reference that challenges list quite well to the different sections.
Yeah.
And and sometimes it'll be a sort of one-to-one thing, and sometimes they'll be a bit spread, but that might let us portion things off for someone to try to finalise or fill in gaps.
Just on the data skills thing, I mean, data skills, I mean, skills are going to be a challenge in any piece of research at scale. I think it's important that we do reference it because there's a skill set that is still very much work in progress, despite the fact that people recognize the importance of data science generally. There's still this kind of huge challenge about finding appropriate skills. Is that something that you would feel is an appropriate challenge to raise, Valerie? And are you happy that that's going to have a place? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah, I think we talked about that quite a bit last week, didn't we, when we had that meeting where we didn't overlap and
okay.
So I sort of did that separate document in response to a conversation we had.
All right. Okay. Well, that hasn't been taken in yet.
Yeah, I kind of did a brain dump of various points that could be made, and I'm quite happy to then work up the ones we do want to include and drop things that you think are,
So I guess what I'm going to suggest is I'm getting availability for doing work on this to get us to a draft, a real, what we might think of as a stable draft. And rather than trampling all over ourselves, I wonder whether there were moments when members of this group or elsewhere would want to take possession of the document and do some work on it, and we'll just stay off it for a period of time. That's one way. Or we can just, because I just need to make sure that we don't make so many changes across the piece that we're kind of undoing each other's work. I was going to try and have a bit more of a go on this immediately after this meeting, just following these comments. So if you'd bear with me. But the question is, Lorenzo, I mean, in particular, your points have been well made. And I'm keen that we do address, when we talk about data, we do it informed by the actual experience of the modelers in this context. I think that will just make it more powerful. So one or two notes that allow us to add the experience about, for example, around the international point you made, the international Italian data, the Italian data that allowed you to kind of reimagine. I mean, this will happen frequently. It's a particular example that would scale quite nicely.
Yeah, I wanted to add it. I just couldn't find the right section where to add it at the moment. It's probably in the data and models. Or
so I wonder whether the best thing at the moment is just to say, if people, a little bit like Alice has done, in that case, just write a couple of paragraphs in a freestanding document, and then we will work on the integration point in the next week or so, okay?
Okay.
So where people feel they've got something that they can't work out quite where it fits, but it needs to be said.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like constantly coming back to Richard's challenge set. What I will try and do, and I really will try and do, is take these in the next few number of days, so that when we meet next week, we'll see whether we've gotten closer to a paper that meets the points made today. Does that seem reasonable? Yeah.
Yeah. I'll definitely write something down then.
There's some de-emphasis as well. Yeah. I think
I will. Thank you.
In some areas. Yeah.
I've created a deconflicted version of the challenges because it had already got conflicted.
Yeah, that's well.
So there's now a challenges version 2, which I'm just editing, but I've merged in the changes that people made.
Yeah. And it's not particularly much easier with Google Docs either. You end up trampling all over each other, they're not careful. So anyway, listen, if we meet at 10:30 next week, I know the clock is ticking and that will almost be the end of March. I haven't looked too closely. So, some papers seem to be more developed than others, is all I'll say. I think everybody's suffering the same thing. Some are looking really quite finished. These are going to appear not in one big bang, but as a series of sequential releases. Is that right, Valerie?
They can be submitted when they're ready. I mean, hopefully not too distantly, but they can appear. They'll be accepted and will appear online. as they're accepted. We don't have to wait for everything. You know, we're not waiting for the last one.
I think one of the most important lessons I've learned today is you can never assume. It was so interesting to kind of sit here with your data-centric hat on and think that FAIR is what the scientific community is working to. And that's a really, really helpful reminder.
The fact that I wasn't aware of it doesn't really mean anything. I tend to be quite impenetrable to stuff that
No. But
knowledge, I'll say.
I think you might actually. Yeah. Okay. All right. I think it's a common experience. All right. So we meet next week. Okay. That's just on the hour. That's great. Thank you very much. Take care. Cheers. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.